Something about this didn't sit right. Multiple media voices suddenly agreed that Shedeur Sanders wasn't NFL ready way too early. Not just criticism, certainty. Then G. Bush stepped in and challenged everything, and what started as a debate quickly turned into something much bigger than football. But what if this wasn't just a bad take? What if it was something deeper? It started with a take that didn't just feel strong, it felt final, like the conclusion had already been written before the story even had a chance to unfold. When Jason Lloyd spoke about Shedeur Sanders, it wasn't framed as uncertainty or projection. It came off like a verdict, and that's what immediately caught people off guard. Because in the NFL, especially with young quarterbacks, nothing is ever that simple. At first, it sounded like standard criticism. Questions about processing speed, concerns about decision-making, maybe even some doubts about long-term upside. That's normal. Every rookie quarterback faces that kind of scrutiny. But this didn't stop there. The conversation quickly shifted into something much heavier. Suddenly, it wasn't just about what Shedeur Sanders was doing on the field. It became about who he was as a player at his core. There were claims suggesting he couldn't read defenses, that his film study wasn't where it needed to be, that he lacked the awareness required to succeed at the next level. And the tone of those claims, that's where things started to feel different. It wasn't framed as development. It wasn't framed as he needs time. It was framed like a ceiling had already been placed on him. And that's unusual this early. Because we're not talking about a full season of struggles. We're not talking about years of data. We're talking about a limited sample size, brief appearances, early stage reps, and a situation that hadn't fully played out yet. Judging a quarterback that quickly and with that level of certainty raised a serious question: where was this confidence coming from? Even more interesting, the justification kept circling back to data and analytics. But here's the issue: analytics in football rarely speak in absolutes, especially with young players. They point out trends, they highlight tendencies, they leave room for growth. What people were hearing here didn't sound like that. It sounded definitive, like there was no path forward. And that's when fans started paying closer attention. Because when criticism shifts from performance to personal capability this early, it stops feeling like analysis and starts feeling like something else. Something more fixed, more decided. And whether intentional or not, that kind of framing carries weight, especially when it comes from established voices. So the real question became unavoidable. Was this truly an evaluation, or was it the beginning of a narrative? And that's exactly where things started to take a turn. But just as that narrative started settling in, someone finally stepped in and disrupted the flow. And not in a loud, chaotic way, but in a way that forced people to actually think. When G. Bush entered the conversation, he didn't come in swinging wildly. He came in asking questions, and those questions, they immediately made things uncomfortable. Because instead of attacking the take, he challenged the certainty behind it. He pointed out something that most people either missed or ignored. If the information about Shedeur Sanders was coming from people inside the building, and those same people were no longer there, then why was that same narrative still being repeated like it was current fact? That's not a small detail, that changes everything. Because in the NFL, situations evolve fast, coaching staffs change, front office perspectives shift, player development takes unexpected turns. So if your entire evaluation is built on voices that are no longer part of the situation, then what exactly are you standing on? That's the question G. Bush quietly put on the table, and nobody had a clean answer for it. And instead of the conversation adjusting, something else happened. It stayed the same. The same talking points, the same conclusions, the same level of confidence, almost like the narrative had already been locked in regardless of what was actually happening in real time. And that's when things started to feel a little off. Because normally, when new information challenges an old take, there's at least some level of recalibration. Here, there was. If anything, the defense of that original stance got stronger. And that's what made G. Bush's approach stand out even more. He wasn't claiming Shedeur Sanders was perfect. He wasn't saying there weren't areas to improve. What he was questioning was the rush to define him so early and with such finality. That's a completely different conversation. He essentially slowed everything down and forced people to look at the timeline, forced them to consider context, and most importantly, forced them to recognize that repeating something doesn't automatically make it accurate, especially if the foundation behind it has already changed. Some fans started to pick up on that shift immediately, because now it wasn't just about whether Shedeur Sanders was good or not. It became about how these opinions were being formed in the first place. And once that question enters the conversation, everything starts to feel a little less solid. Because if the source is shaky, then what does that say about the story? And that's when the entire tone of the discussion began to change. And that's when things stopped being subtle and started happening in real time. Because once the discussion moved onto a live setting, the dynamic completely changed. It wasn't just about takes anymore, it was about how those takes were being handled in the moment. And that's where people really started paying attention. Because when G. Bush began laying out his points, something felt off almost immediately. It wasn't what he was saying. It was how often he wasn't allowed to finish saying it. You could see it unfold. Every time he started building momentum, breaking something down, or pushing the conversation into uncomfortable territory, he'd get interrupted, cut off, redirected. Meanwhile, other voices in the room were getting full, uninterrupted stretches to speak. Minutes at a time, no pressure, no urgency, just space to reinforce the same narrative. And that contrast didn't go unnoticed. Especially when Tyvis Powell stepped in to defend Jason Lloyd, who, at that moment, wasn't even present to defend himself. Think about that for a second. The strongest pushback wasn't coming from the original source of the take, it was coming from others stepping in to hold the line. That's when the situation started to feel less like a debate and more like a setup. Because in a real discussion, ideas are supposed to be challenged. That's how clarity happens, that's how better takes emerge. But here, the energy felt different. It felt like certain points were being protected while others were being managed, controlled, limited before they could fully land. And G. Bush called it out directly. He pointed out the imbalance, the fact that others had been speaking freely for minutes while he was being stopped within seconds, around 30 seconds to be exact. And once he said that out loud, it changed how everything looked. Because now the audience wasn't just listening to what was being said, they were watching how the conversation was being handled. And once you notice that, it's hard to unsee. Because if the argument is strong, you don't need to protect it. You don't need to interrupt opposing views. You don't need to control the flow. You let it breathe, you let it get challenged, and you trust that it will hold up. But that's not what was happening here. Instead, the more G. Bush pushed, the tighter the conversation seemed to get. More interruptions, more deflections, more subtle attempts to steer things back to safer ground, and whether intentional or not, it created a very clear impression. This wasn't just about discussing Shedeur Sanders anymore. This was about controlling the narrative around him. And that realization is what made everything that followed hit even harder. And that's when the conversation quietly shifted into something much bigger than just one take. Because once people stepped back and looked at the full picture, a pattern started to emerge. It wasn't just one voice being overly critical of Shedeur Sanders. It was multiple voices, different platforms, different segments, all circling around the same exact points, almost word for word. And that's where things started to feel coordinated. Not confirmed, not proven, but noticeable. Because in most sports debates, even the harshest criticisms come with variety. One analyst might question mechanics, another might focus on decision-making, someone else might bring up coaching or system fit. There's usually disagreement, even among people who lean in the same direction. But here, that variation was missing. Instead, the messaging felt aligned. The same doubts about intelligence, the same claims about film study, the same certainty about his ceiling, repeated again and again across different voices without much pushback from within that circle. And when that kind of consistency shows up without debate, it naturally raises questions. Because that's not how open discussion usually works. That's how echo chambers work. And fans started picking up on that quickly. You could see it in reactions online. You could feel the shift in tone. People weren't just reacting to the takes anymore, they were reacting to how similar all the takes sounded. Some fans began to question whether these opinions were being independently formed or simply reinforced within a closed group. Now, to be clear, that doesn't automatically mean anything intentional was happening. But perception matters. And when multiple media voices repeat the same strong narrative without challenging each other, it creates the impression that the conclusion has already been agreed upon behind the scenes, that the debate isn't really a debate, it's a reinforcement loop. Some fans believe this wasn't just coincidence. Others think it's just how media ecosystems naturally operate. where ideas spread quickly and get amplified by people in the same circles. But regardless of the cause, the effect was the same. The narrative around Shedeur Sanders started to feel less like a collection of independent evaluations and more like a unified storyline. And once that perception sets in, trust becomes a factor. Because fans don't just listen to what's being said, they pay attention to how it's being said, who's saying it, and how often it's repeated. And when everything starts to sound the same, it doesn't necessarily strengthen the argument. Sometimes it does the opposite. It makes people question it. That's exactly what started happening here. The more the narrative was repeated, the more people began to step back and ask, why is there no disagreement? Why is nobody pushing back internally? And more importantly, why does it feel like this story is being protected instead of tested? Because real analysis evolves. Real debate creates friction. But when there's no friction, when every voice seems to move in the same direction, it stops feeling like analysis altogether. It starts feeling like something else. And that realization is what pushed this entire situation into a completely different category. But just when it seemed like the narrative couldn't get any more confusing, it did. Because out of nowhere, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders stopped being about his development and started turning into a revolving door of other quarterbacks. New names kept popping up, new comparisons, new options, and the way those names were being introduced, that's what really made people pause. One minute, it was Dylan Gabriel being pushed as a serious alternative. Talk about upside, readiness, fit, the kind of buzz you usually hear when someone is being positioned as the future, but before that conversation could even fully settle, it faded. Then came more names. Geno Smith got thrown into discussions, a veteran presence, a safer option, someone who could stabilize things. Then right behind him, mentions of Anthony Richardson and Malik Willis started surfacing. Different styles, different ceilings, different timelines, but all being casually inserted into the same conversation like interchangeable pieces. And that's when it started to feel less like evaluation and more like rotation. Because none of these names stayed long enough to be seriously examined. They'd enter the conversation with energy, get people talking, then quietly disappear when the next name showed up. No real follow-up, no consistent comparison, just a constant shift in focus. It felt like musical chairs. And if you've been watching the NFL long enough, you've seen this before. Take Kenny Pickett as an example. At one point, he was being talked about like a long-term answer, a stable piece, someone teams could build around. There was optimism, there was belief, but the moment things didn't click instantly, the tone changed, quickly. Suddenly, that same confidence disappeared and the conversation moved on. That pattern started looking very familiar. Because what was happening here didn't feel like a steady evaluation process. It felt like a cycle: build someone up, shift attention, move on, repeat. And every time the spotlight changed, the narrative reset like the previous one never happened. That's what made this situation different. Because instead of one clear direction, there were too many directions being pushed at once. Too many solutions, too many alternatives. And when that happens, it doesn't create clarity, it creates confusion. Fans don't know what to believe. One week they're told one quarterback is the answer. The next week it's someone else entirely. And through all of that movement, one thing stayed consistent. Shedeur Sanders remained at the center of the debate. But not always in a fair way. Because while other quarterbacks were being discussed with possibility, words like potential, development, upside, the tone around Shedeur often felt more fixed, more decided, less flexible, and that contrast didn't go unnoticed. Some fans began to question whether this constant rotation of names was actually about finding the best option or simply about keeping the conversation alive, keeping the debate going, keeping the uncertainty in place. Because as long as there's another name to bring up, there's always another argument to make. And that's what made the entire situation feel unstable. Not because of the players themselves, but because of how quickly the narrative kept changing around them. One week someone's the future. The next week they're barely mentioned. And when that keeps happening over and over again, it raises a serious question. Is this really about football decisions, or is it about controlling the conversation? But here, where the entire story really started to crack. Because for weeks, one of the biggest talking points surrounding Shedeur Sanders was this idea that he was walking into a crowded, high-pressure quarterback battle. A situation packed with competition, multiple names, multiple threats, a fight for the starting job that supposedly hadn't even come close to being decided. That narrative sounded intense. It sounded dramatic. And more importantly, it kept people watching. But once it actually got broken down, piece by piece, things didn't look nearly as complicated as they were being presented. That's where G. Bush stepped in again, and instead of speaking in general terms, he got specific. He started naming names, one by one, and as he went down that list, something interesting happened. The competition started disappearing. Names that had been casually thrown into the conversation, like Geno Smith, Anthony Richardson, and Malik Willis, were suddenly being reframed. Not as real contenders, but as unlikely, unrealistic, or simply not part of the actual situation. And when you remove those names, the entire idea of a stacked quarterback room starts to fall apart. Because what was being presented as a crowded race started to look more like a conversation filled with hypotheticals. What if scenarios, names that sounded good in debate but didn't necessarily reflect reality on the ground. And that's a big difference. Because there's a difference between real competition and the idea of competition. Real competition shows up in reps, in practice rotations, in coaching decisions, in actual opportunities to win a job, but what people were seeing here felt more like a narrative built around possibilities rather than actual circumstances. Some fans started to notice that disconnect. Because when you strip away the extra noise, the situation became much simpler than it was being portrayed. The so-called quarterback battle didn't look as deep, it didn't look as chaotic, and it definitely didn't look as undecided as people were being led to believe. Now, to be fair, competition always exists in the NFL. No job is truly handed over without pressure. That's the nature of the league. But the way this specific situation was being framed, that's where the questions came in. Some believe the competition narrative may have been overstated. Not necessarily fabricated, but amplified, stretched just enough to create tension, enough to keep debates going, enough to keep uncertainty alive. Because uncertainty drives attention, and attention keeps the conversation moving. But here's the problem with that approach: when the reality doesn't match the story, people eventually catch on. And that's exactly what started happening. Because as more details came out, and as voices like G. Bush continued to challenge the framing, fans began to reassess what they were being told. They started separating actual football decisions from the way those decisions were being presented publicly. And once that separation happens, the narrative loses its grip. Because now, instead of asking who's going to win the job, people started asking a different question. Was there ever a real battle to begin with? And that question changes everything. Because if the competition wasn't as real as it was being portrayed, then what was the purpose of pushing it so hard in the first place? That's the moment where the story stops being about quarterbacks and starts being about control. And just when it seemed like the narrative couldn't get any more layered, this is where things got even more complicated. Because now the conversation wasn't just about performance anymore, it shifted into something deeper: development, opportunity, and most importantly, access. One of the biggest claims being circulated was that Shedeur Sanders was falling behind, that he wasn't picking up the playbook fast enough, that he wasn't quite ready to handle the system. On the surface, that sounds like a normal football discussion. Every young quarterback faces that challenge at some point. But when you actually start looking at the situation more closely, that explanation doesn't feel as complete as it first appears. Because development in the NFL isn't just about talent, it's about reps. It's about who gets the opportunities, who gets the snaps, who gets placed in positions to actually learn in real time. And that's where this entire situation starts to raise questions. Because reports and observations from that period suggest that Shedeur wasn't always given the same level of access as others in the room. There were stretches where he wasn't rotating consistently with the first team. Moments where he was working on separate fields. Situations where his exposure seemed limited. Now, to be fair, team structure practices differently for a lot of reasons. coaching strategies vary, development plans aren't always public, and sometimes decisions are made behind the scenes that fans never fully see. But even with that in mind, the contrast here was noticeable enough that people started paying attention. Because while Shedeur's reps appeared restricted, other quarterbacks like Dillon Gabriel were getting more visible opportunities, more time with different units, more chances to show what they could do within the system. And naturally, that leads to a very simple question. How do you fairly evaluate two players if they're not being given the same platform? That's where the entire "he's falling behind" argument starts to feel a little shaky. Because there's a difference between a player struggling to keep up and a player not being fully put in position to keep up in the first place. And that distinction matters. Some reports claim that coaching decisions influenced how reps were distributed during that time. Others suggest it was part of a broader development approach. And then there are fans who believe those early limitations may have shaped the entire perception around Shedeur more than his actual performance ever did. But here, the key point, none of those perspectives can be confirmed as absolute. What can be observed is the outcome. Because when a player gets fewer opportunities, fewer visible reps, and less exposure in key situations, it naturally affects how they're viewed. The numbers look different, the tape looks limited, the evaluation becomes incomplete. And once that incomplete picture enters the public conversation, it can quickly turn into a full narrative. That's what makes this situation so difficult to pin down. Because now, you're not just evaluating a player, you're evaluating the environment around that player. And that's exactly what G. Bush started pointing toward, not as a definitive accusation but as a question worth asking. Was Shedeur actually behind, or did the structure around him make it look that way? Because if a player isn't given equal chances to operate within the system, then any judgment about their readiness becomes incomplete at best. And once that idea enters the conversation, it changes everything. Because now, instead of asking, why wasn't he producing more, people start asking, was he ever given a real chance to produce in the first place? And that question hits differently. Because it shifts the focus away from the player and puts it directly on the situation. On the decisions being made behind the scenes. On the gap between perception and reality. And once fans start connecting those dots, the entire narrative becomes a lot harder to accept at face value. Because in the NFL, talent matters. But opportunity, that's what determines whether anyone ever gets to prove it. But here, where things truly get messy, and where the story around Shedeur Sanders starts to separate fact from fiction. Because for weeks, the narrative wasn't just about his skills, his development, or his reps, it was about perception. What the media wanted fans to see, not what was actually happening on the field, and that distinction makes all the difference. Some outlets pushed the idea that Shedeur was somehow behind, unprepared, or not processing the game fast enough. They framed it as a simple story, young quarterback, small mistakes, needs time. That's believable at first glance. But as G. Bush highlighted, the story started to crumble the moment you looked at the environment around him. Here's the reality: opportunity wasn't equal, reps weren't equal, access wasn't equal. While Shedeur was being limited, kept on separate fields, rotating less with the first team, and controlled in his exposure, other quarterbacks were being given a platform. Dillon Gabriel, for instance, got reps with twos, sometimes even ones, creating the illusion that he was ahead or more prepared. But that wasn't a result of performance, that was a result of circumstance. And that's exactly what some fans started noticing. The more you break down the situation, the more it becomes clear that the falling behind narrative wasn't about talent, it was about optics. It was about shaping perception, not reflecting reality. Because when someone's exposure is limited, naturally the stats, highlights, and visible performance seem weaker. And if you take those surface-level observations without context, it suddenly looks like failure. But it's not, it's restriction. Even more striking, once G. Bush stepped in and laid it all out, the contrast became obvious. He showed how the coaching decisions, limited reps, and media narratives all lined up not by coincidence but by design. And when fans started seeing that, it changed the conversation. Suddenly, it wasn't just about who was better or ready. It was about the story being told, about the control of the narrative itself. And that's what makes this situation so dangerous for the media. People can see it unravel in real time. As G. Bush broke down the claims and compared footage, the gaps became visible. The reality of Shedeur's composure, decision-making, and field awareness didn't match the repeated talking points that suggested he was unprepared or behind. Those early takes, presented as analysis, began to feel misleading. Meanwhile, the constant rotation of other quarterback names, Geno Smith, Anthony Richardson, Malik Willis, and even Kenny Pickett, was exposed as smoke and mirrors. It wasn't about competition or talent evaluation. It was about keeping the discussion alive, keeping drama alive, and keeping viewers engaged with uncertainty. And once that pattern was visible, fans started questioning everything they had been told. Because here's the undeniable truth: talent shows, opportunity matters, and perception doesn't always reflect either. Shedeur Sanders had the talent, he had the readiness, but he was up against a carefully crafted narrative designed to control how people perceived him. And that narrative, limited reps, selective exposure, recycled talking points, was starting to fall apart in front of everyone. Once that curtain was pulled back, the difference between perception and reality became undeniable. And that's why this moment matters more than anyone realizes. Because in the NFL, narratives can stick for months. They can influence fan opinion, media framing, and even team discussion. But when someone like G. Bush steps in and lays out the facts clearly, the illusion begins to crumble. Suddenly, the story shifts. It's no longer about potential failures. It's no longer about a quarterback falling behind. It's about understanding the difference between what actually happened and what people were told happened. And in that space between perception and reality, the truth becomes hard to ignore. Shedeur Sanders wasn't struggling. He wasn't behind. He wasn't unprepared. He was being restricted. And when you factor in everything, the coaching decisions, the media narratives, the limited reps, you realize that the entire conversation was skewed from the start. Now, fans aren't just watching football, they're watching a narrative unravel. And once the reality is out in front of them, there's no going back. The story is clear. Perception doesn't always equal reality, and sometimes the quietest, most prepared players are the ones being held back by forces they can't control. And now, after all the chaos, the back and forth, the interruptions, and the overhyped narratives, we arrive at the real question. Not about stats, not about hype, not about potential. The real question is simple, but it hits hard: who is actually controlling the story? Because if you step back and look at what happened, it's clear that this wasn't just a debate about Shedeur Sanders. It wasn't about reps or OTAs or even his ability to read a defense. It was about the way the narrative was shaped, repeated, and defended, even when the facts didn't fully support it. For weeks, the media presented a script: young quarterback, limited experience, potential falling behind, needs more time. And what made it stick wasn't analysis, it was repetition. The same talking points circulated, echoing through comment sections, highlight reels, and podcasts until fans started accepting them as truth. But here's the kicker: that story didn't survive scrutiny. Not when someone like G. Bush stepped in. Not when the facts, the footage, and the context were put on the table. Once you see who got reps, who was held back, and how the system worked around him, the whole narrative begins to collapse. It's not that the media was wrong about football, it's that the story they sold didn't match the reality. And that's the real question we have to ask ourselves. If the story isn't accurate, why did so many people believe it? Why did fans, analysts, and even insiders treat it as fact? The answer is uncomfortable but simple: because controlling perception is often more powerful than controlling performance. The media cycle thrives on tension, on drama, on uncertainty. It's easier to talk about a hypothetical quarterback battle than it is to acknowledge that the starter is already locked in. It's easier to hype one player one week, discard him the next, and move on to the next big thing, than to provide a measured, consistent evaluation. And if you control that narrative, you control the conversation. You guide how fans feel. You shape debates before the tape even speaks for itself. But that control has limits. And when someone interrupts the cycle, when someone lays out the facts, checks the names, and challenges the narrative, everything shifts. Suddenly, the illusion of chaos collapses. Suddenly, the scripted battle vanishes. Suddenly, you see clearly: Shedeur Sanders isn't struggling. He isn't behind. He isn't waiting for potential to mature. He's ready. And the only thing standing in the way of the truth was the story itself. That's why this moment matters so much. Because it's bigger than one player. It's bigger than a team or a season. It's a reminder that narratives are powerful and that repetition can feel like fact. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, especially when someone refuses to let the false story dominate. And here's the takeaway: talent shows, opportunity matters, and perception doesn't always reflect reality. In Shedeur Sanders' case, the narrative built by limited reps, selective exposure, and amplified talking points couldn't withstand scrutiny. The moment facts were put on display, everything changed. So the real question isn't whether he's ready. The real question isn't about reps or stats. The real question is, will people keep letting narratives shape their understanding, or will they look at the evidence and see what's actually happening on the field? Because when you see it clearly, when you connect the dots between opportunity, exposure, and performance, the answer becomes obvious. Shedeur Sanders isn't the problem. The system wasn't stacked against him by accident, and the media's attempts to shape perception only work until someone calls them out. And that's where we leave it, because now the story isn't about speculation, it isn't about hype, it's about clarity, it's about seeing the player for what he is, and once you do, everything else, every interruption, every false narrative, every what-if scenario falls away. The real question remains, and it's the one that matters most. Are you paying attention to the story or to the narrative they're trying to sell you?